Please join me now in a spirit of meditation and prayer. After our spoken prayer and a time of silence, we will sing together Spirit of Life, hymn number 123, which is printed in your order of service. We'll sing first in English and then in Spanish. This morning's prayer is by Stephen Schick. Spirit of my longing and lonely heart, help me to travel through the barren borderlands that separate me from others. Teach me to willingly explore relationships with those who frighten or threaten me. Grant me the courage to risk confidently my own comforts, that I might make others more comfortable. And when I am burdened by the isolating choices I have made, grant me the wisdom to invite a stranger to travel with me. Open my heart to my new companion's needs and desires until I relax my defensiveness and become a calming presence. As we travel, grant me the vision to notice how each step we take together moves us closer to the promised land, where all souls grow in hope and the resilience of love. Amen. Our reading this morning is entitled, Infighting is Easier, by Teresa Honey Youngblood. She begins with a quote, "We are not primarily put on this earth to see through one another, but to see one another through." Standing roadside, she says, stranded, watching thousands of dollars rise in the smoke coming from under the hood, it's easier to fight about who forgot to put the oil in the car than to hold one another's shaking hands in the shape-shifting uncertainty. There's almost a pleasant mastery in stalking powerfully through the apartment, muttering about a roommate's missteps. It's harder to sit across from one another, spiritually naked, to learn if there is a place between us where we can both feel seen and safe, exposed and accepted, held up to our highest standards for ourselves, and helped to get there. And how about the seductive rush of shouting down a friend of a friend on Facebook? Do we point the way toward right with an olive branch or a sword? Defender of purity is an identity we feel good about, while imperfect and occasionally misguided fellow traveler on the rocky and misty road is scary and means that our future might not be ours alone to control. Infighting lies about what matters. It's a vacation in the briar patch on the way up the mountain, the distraction of 1,000 bloody scratches rather than the deep wound of knowing that we and everyone we care about will die before the work is done, and that babies born this very moment will be broken by our failures. Even inside this searing truth, we are saving each other with each step forward together. Do we point the way toward right with an olive branch or a sword? I love that question. It's one I wrestle with. And of course it begs the follow-up question, and what about the times we are not right? But that is a sermon for another day. Just for today, let's assume that we are right and everyone else is wrong, and the problem is not our own mistakes, but rather the best way to point toward right so that others may join us there. If you are married or have children or run a business, this scenario is not going to be very hard for you to imagine. But I'm not really talking here about who should have done the laundry. I'm talking about the larger injustices that we might encounter in our day. One of the responsibilities we have when we see injustice happening is to speak up. It's not a comfortable thing to do for many of us. It takes conviction and courage. It takes knowing yourself and your beliefs really well, and valuing the rights not just of yourself, but of others. Even if you're doing it well, it might not feel good to speak up. So that's hard. We usually think that if we're doing something right, it will feel good. As Unitarian Universalists, we are helping each other to learn this skill of speaking up and speaking out. It's part of what we do together. In fact, at one of our racial justice Provincetown meetings this year, we literally practiced aloud together some of the simple things we could say when we see or hear something that is unjust. We said things like, "Ouch," and "Hey, that's not cool," and "What you just said made me really uncomfortable," and "I see what you're doing." So we are learning to speak up, and we are getting better at it, or at least we are on this journey where we are starting to see injustice now, where once we were blind to it. And that is a really good thing. And we are practicing speaking up within our own circles of Unitarian Universalism. This seems to be a more comfortable learning field than in the wider world. And since we've all kind of opted in to wanting to get this right, we are starting to hold each other to higher standards around racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and cultural appropriation and all kinds of things. One problem, though, as I see it, is that this commitment to working on our own isms and the culture of our denomination on a national level has really come to a head right at the time when most of our communication is happening online. So as we have these really difficult conversations, we aren't face to face or in the room with each other. We haven't spent time getting to know one another or being in relationship. We're just at home, by ourselves, in front of a computer. And boy, are we emboldened by that screen, right? It is so much easier to speak up when we are typing it instead of saying it. We might even use all caps for emphasis. You know that using all caps means you're shouting, right? And so we end up being pretty harsh with each other, actually. Online spaces have become minefields where any post can be pounced on by well-meaning, faithful activists wielding their righteousness like a sword. I use Unitarian Universalism as an example, but really there are so many communities who are in this same space with each other at this moment. Don't even get me started on the Provincetown Community Space Facebook page. Adrienne Marie Brown, who wrote the book Emergent Strategy that I have quoted a few times already this summer, is not a Unitarian Universalist, but she is an activist and has recognized this same trend in her circles of activism. I have been in movement spaces for a long time, she says, and we have a way of doing things that is so steeped in critique that I have often wondered if we would strangle movement before it could blossom. Sometimes I think we put up the critiques to excuse ourselves from getting involved. And sometimes I think we do it to protect our hearts from getting broken if it doesn't work out. This temptation to critique rather than engage, this tendency to use our swords instead of our olive branches to point the way, is part of something called call-out culture. And although calling others out is one tool in the toolbox of justice-making, it's not always the one that we should reach for first. I'm thinking of that expression, when you're holding a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. Writer Ashley Ostrew points out that call-outs can be performative, done more to signal one's own virtues than to enact any meaningful change. Here are some examples that came to mind for me when I was thinking about this. When Texas was suffering from severe flooding a few years ago, the top reaction on my news feed was liberals calling out a conservative Christian church for not opening its doors to people during the flood. I think maybe our hearts were breaking so much by seeing so much suffering, and we didn't know how to help. But sitting with that helplessness felt bad. So we found a bad guy to shame, and then we felt better. But we had not actually made the situation any better for those whose homes had been flooded. Or when Notre Dame was burning, and wealthy donors came forward to offer to help to rebuild, and suddenly everyone was posting about better ways to spend that money. So instead of being praised for their generosity, they were being shamed for it. If you step back and think about it, shaming donors is not going to get them to give more money to more causes in the future. It's going to make them think twice about making any donations at all. I say, send those people a thank you note, and then add them to the mailing lists for all of your favorite charities. Recently in my newsfeed, a lot of my friends have been promoting a boycott of Home Depot because its co-founder, Bernie Marcus, is making a huge donation to Trump's re-election campaign. At first, this sounded reasonable. I don't want any of my money going to Trump. But I also didn't have all the information. A colleague of mine, Michael Tino, wrote a response to all of these posts that he was seeing. If you're calling for a boycott of all big box store corporations because capitalism is evil, he said, I'm all for that. But please do your research before joining a boycott. Bernie Marcus has not been affiliated with Home Depot for 17 years. In the meantime, it has become a fairly progressive corporation, as big corporations go, see capitalism is evil, and has some of the strongest anti-discrimination policies around, thanks in part to UUA shareholder activism. I'm sure Marcus owns stock in Home Depot, he said, but so does the UUA Common Endowment Plan. If you're boycotting every corporation in which reprehensible people own stock, again, I'm good with that. But please don't be reactionary about it. Adrienne Marie Brown says, I've watched several public takedowns, call-outs, and other grievances take place on social and mainstream media. Some of those have been of strangers, but recently I've had the experience of seeing people I know and love targeted and taken down. In most cases, very complex realities get watered down into one flawed aspect of these people's personalities, or one mistake or misunderstanding. A mob mentality takes over then, an evisceration of character that is punitive, traumatizing, and isolating. This has happened with increasing frequency over the past year, she says, such that I'm wondering if those of us with an intention of transforming the world have a common understanding of the kind of justice we want to practice. What we do now is find out someone or some group has done or may have done something out of alignment with our values. Some of the transgressions are small, some are massive. We then tear that person or group to shreds in a way that affirms our values. We create memes, reducing someone to the laughing stock of the internet that day. We write think pieces on how we are not like that person and obviously wouldn't make the same mistakes they have made. We deconstruct them as thinkers, activists, groups, bodies, partners, children, finding all of the contradictions and limitations and shining bright light on them. When we are satisfied that that person or group is destroyed, we move on. I say we and our intentionally here. She says, I'm not above this behavior. I laugh at the memes. I like the rants with no named target that very clearly critique a specific person. I've been examining this, why I can get caught up in a mob on the internet in a way that I rarely do in life. I have noticed that at the most basic level, I feel better about myself because I'm on the right side of history, or at least the news cycle. But lately, she says, as the attacks grow faster and more vicious, I wonder, is this what we're here for? To cultivate a fear-based adherence to reductive common values? Can this lead to, and what can this lead to in an imperfect world full of sloppy, complex humans? Is it possible we will call each other out until there's no one left beside us? This call-out culture is becoming toxic, and it's masking some of our real feelings and keeping us from some of the real work to be done. I saw a great quote the other day that says, I sat with anger long enough until she told me her real name was grief. Call-out culture allows us to forget that we are in relationship with people, with the ones who we believe are wrong, but also with the people we think we are defending. My colleague, Reverend Derek Jackson, told me a story about his 10th grade American history class. His teacher was a self-proclaimed hippie who was known for his radical opinions and loved to shake things up a little. One day, near the end of the semester, the teacher gave the class an essay to read that had the N-word in it. During the next class session, one of Derek's classmates, a white female, began the conversation with a diatribe about the essay. She ranted about how inappropriate it was to use that language and spent a lot of time talking about how offended Derek was as the only African American in the class, and all of his hurt feelings. Her words might have been fine if we had talked about my feelings around this essay, Derek remembers, but we had not. I felt very uncomfortable at that moment and a little angry. I felt that she was using me to show just how great an ally she was, and maybe as a cover for her own discomfort with the essay. When the girl finished, the teacher came to Derek and asked him for his thoughts. Derek told the class that although he did not like the word, he understood how the author was making a statement on educational institutions as systems of oppression, and the word made sense in his time and context. The teacher took that moment to talk to the class about speaking on behalf of people without being in relationship with them, and ensuring that you are speaking for or with them and not about them. Relationship helps us to be grounded in authentic justice work, Derek says, and not veer into self-righteousness. So now you're probably thinking, I will never speak up again. And if that is the message you take from this morning, I am very sorry for that. So hang in there. We still have a few minutes left to redeem this. But what is the alternative here? Should we stay silent? Should we not use our privilege to call others out when they are supporting systems of oppression, when they are hurting people's feelings or creating unsafe environments? Calling out can be powerful at drawing attention to problematic behavior, particularly among high-profile individuals, businesses, or institutions. It is an important tool in our toolbox, but it is not the only tool. You see, lying right there beside calling out is the tool of calling in. In an article entitled "Calling In versus Calling Out," Ashley Ostru writes, "In social justice circles, calling in refers to the act of checking your peers and getting them to change problematic behavior by explaining their misstep with compassion and patience. Picture a huddle where you bring someone in and talk about the game plan to get on the same page. Calling in involves taking people aside, like your family, coworkers, or even fellow activists, and addressing them in a patient, caring, and human way to help them grow. As Caitlin Burns observed for Everyday Feminism, this approach allows people to learn without feeling singled out or publicly embarrassed. Calling in takes more work than calling out. And we're not always up for that extra work, especially if we are the ones whose feelings have been hurt or safety threatened. But when we are up for it, the possible transformation that can happen is far greater than with calling out. Adrienne Marie Brown suggests that one question to ask ourselves is, how can my real-time actions contribute to transforming this situation? This question feels particularly important in the age of social media, she says, where we can make our own pain viral before we've even had a chance to feel it. Often we are well down a path of public shaming and punishment before we have any facts about what's happening. There are times when that kind of calling out is the only option, she says, particularly in relation to those of great privilege who are not within our reach. But if you have each other's phone numbers, or are within 2 degrees of social media connection, and particularly if you are the small percentage of humans trying to change the world, you actually have access to transformative justice in real time. Real time is slower than social media time, she says, where everything feels urgent. Real time often includes periods of silence, reflection, growth, space, self-forgiveness, processing with loved ones, rest, and responsibility. This is some of the hardest work. It's not about pack hunting an external enemy. It's about deep shifts in our own ways of being. Now, of course, I don't have all this figured out myself. That's part of the reason I'm quoting so many other people this morning. They seem better at this than me. Monday night, I went to see the comedic writer David Sedaris at the Barnstable Performing Arts Center. There were about 700 people there. I found a lot of his stories very funny, but much of it was also problematic. He had this habit of letting us know whenever any of the characters in his story were black, but he didn't do that with other people in his stories. And he made remarks about the black people in his stories being poor, probably going to community college rather than university, and being in line for diabetes. And he said really thoughtless things about trans folks. He complained about how many initials we needed to add now after GLBT, After a while, my friend and I started squirming in our seats. He'd already made a joke about how people are too sensitive these days, that not everything is a microaggression, and that people shouldn't get in trouble for every little thing they say. So when the lights came up for question and answer time, we weren't really sure what to do. Part of me didn't want to ruin the night for the 700 people who had all shelled out $50 to see him. Part of me didn't want to call him out publicly, but rather call him in. Come on, David, I wanted to say, you're one of us. You've been discriminated against your whole life for being gay. Don't you want to use your privilege to help the next initial along? But I didn't. I didn't do anything. My friend told me she was probably going to write a letter. I'm still thinking about it. And I guess I kind of just called out David Sedaris in this sermon. But in my defense, I do not have his phone number. So no, I don't have this whole thing figured out. I just know that I don't want to do all my justice work in a silo, or on the internet, or in all caps. I want to figure it out alongside all of you, and in relationship with others, and in a way that I can be proud of instead of embarrassed by. And that may mean slowing down to real time, periods of silence, reflection, growth, space, self-forgiveness, processing with loved ones, rest, and responsibility. That may mean some deep shifts in my own ways of being. My friend Derek, who reflected on his 10th grade history class experience, wrote this prayer that might help me, and maybe it will help you too. Spirit of truth and justice, help us to know when to speak, to whom and with whom and for whom we speak. Help us to remember the power of our relationships, to allow those connections to guide us in our communication. May we not be too proud to think that we know what others believe, what others may want, without asking. May we be cognizant of the impact of our words. May we own the impact, no matter the intention, and take that as a path toward growth and learning, and healthy, honest relationships. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.